Alright guys, welcome back into the channel. Welcome into Contemporary Issue Wednesday. Today I'm going to talk to you about the major players in the catastrophe that is the Syrian Civil War. Alright guys, so today we're talking about the Syrian Civil War. Now, in future episodes on Historical Mondays, I'm going to do 4 or 5 episodes, a series on the history of the Syrian Civil War, how we got to where we got to. However, for today's purposes, I just want to present to you guys the major domestic, regional, and international players that are influencing the Syrian Civil War, that are making it so hard for there to be a resolution to the catastrophe, the human catastrophe that is the Syrian Civil War. So let's get into it. The first of these players is the Syrian regime, the Assad regime. He was in power, Bashar al-Assad. His family has been in power in Syria for many, many decades. His government is trying to reassert its authority against the opposition group. And so he's a Shia, importantly, he's a Shia Alawite government. He's allied with Iran. He's allied with Lebanon. And he's trying to reassert control of Syria. On the flip side, domestically, you have the opposition forces. These are the people who started to raise up in protest in 2011 to join the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And crucially, within the opposition, you have a big spectrum of different factional opposition groups. So this is the spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you have very liberal, very secular, very democratic opposition groups who want to install that kind of government in Syria. On the flip side, you have jihadi groups who want to establish a very harsh Islamic State and want to have an ability, a sanctuary for Islamic State fighters. And the most notable of these groups is ISIS. In between this spectrum, you have a whole range of different opposition groups, and it's very, very difficult for the international community to make that dividing line between these groups are secular and fine, they respect human rights, these groups are jihadist in nature. And there's a very fine line because there's some Islamic groups within Syria who are fighting who aren't jihadists. They're just sort of fundamentalist Islamic groups, just like Saudi Arabia is a fundamentally Islamic state, but not a terrorist state. So that's the domestic players within Syria. The regional players outside of Syria who are influencing Syria and who actually have some of their forces in Syria, number one is Iran. Iran is the main regional ally of Syria. The reason why is both are Shia. Both want to establish a Shia presence in the Middle East, not just the Persian Gulf where Iran is. And so Iran has been backing the Assad regime with weapons and with a lot of fighters, a lot of trainers, a lot of material resources. Outside of Iran, you also have Lebanon, and particularly the Lebanese group Hamas that's been coming into Syria and helping the Syrian government take back its country. On the flip side of the regional spectrum, you have Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies like Qatar. Now, these regional allies want to assert Sunni presence in the Middle Eastern region, and so they are backing members of the opposition. They back a number of different members of the opposition, and crucially, some of the members that they back, some of the groups they back within the opposition, are some groups that the United States and Europe would not back. They don't want to have these groups being armed. However, the Saudis, the Qataris, they want to arm these groups in order to reassert and have a Sunni presence in Syria. 2 more regional groups we should cover. The Kurds. The Kurds live in Syria, they live in Turkey, they live in Iraq, they live in Iran. They're taking a little bit more and more territory in Syria because they're very good fighters and they're backed and armed a lot by the US and Western forces. The other regional group you have, or the country, is Turkey. Turkey, crucially, doesn't have much sectarian teeth in its game in Syria, except to the extent that it doesn't want the Kurds, who live in Turkey, or a very strong, powerful presence in Turkey, to assert more autonomous authority by getting more and more land in Syria. So Turkey's goal in the conflict is to limit the power that the Kurds get, and to a secondary extent to limit the power of Islamic extremists like ISIS to launch terrorist attacks in Turkey, which they have done, most noticeable of which has been the 2016 bombing of Ataturk Airport. Alright guys, so we've covered domestic, we've covered regional. What about the international players? You have Europe and the United States. Particularly, we'll take the United States. The United States from day one has said we will not support Assad. In order for the Syrian Civil War to end, Assad must go. That's been the announcement from the beginning. So they've been trying rather ineffectively to arm certain members of that opposition group, the more liberal, secular members of the opposition group, but it hasn't really been that effective. And ultimately, the reason the United States and the European Union in general have not been very effective in Syria is because they haven't put their money where their mouth is. They haven't been able to effectively unify and arm the opposition, and even more importantly, you could say they haven't been willing to put any skin in the game militarily. They're not going to put any of their assets in the region in, except a few special forces here and there, which doesn't really make a big difference. They haven't put in any air power. They haven't limited Syria and now Russia's air power in the region. And so for all of the things that the United States and the UN keep saying about how bad the Syrian civil war is and how the United States wants to blame Russia and Assad for the catastrophe that they're causing, it kind of rings a little bit hollow because the United States and Europe isn't willing to actually get into the game. Now, I completely understand why the United States and Europe doesn't want to get in the game. The United States has tried this in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The United States and Europe and NATO tried this in Libya, and all of the times it hasn't worked out very well. So the U.S. is very reticent to come charging into another military engagement in the Middle East, particularly one that's already so divided along sectarian lines. But the flip side of this is, again, your threats, your condemnations of Russia and of Assad ring hollow because you're not actually willing to do anything to stop them. And finally, we have the Russian regime. Now, the Russian regime is involved in Syria. They are backing the Assad regime for a couple of different reasons. The first one is Russia does have some interest in the Middle East, and by far its biggest allies in the Gulf region is Syria. They don't want to see their only big ally in the region be defeated by Saudi and US-backed forces. They want to keep their position in the Middle East. Secondarily, Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has been pursuing just a general foreign policy that is divisive towards the West and is forcing the West to have to respect Russia as an equal. That's really what Vladimir Putin is after. He's after raising the status of Russia back to where it was under the glory days of the Soviet Union. And so if he can disrupt the West's unity by invading Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, the Crimean, if he can disrupt and disqualify or delegitimize the West's credibility by backing the Syrian regime and causing chaos there, he'll do it because he wants to reassert Russian prominence on the international playing field. And so there you go, guys. These are all the different players that are involved in the Syrian civil war. Many of them have different goals. Many of them have diametrically opposed goals to one another. And that's why it's so difficult to have a long-lasting peace be put in place, because all of these different players have all of these different goals, and none of them can actually decide and come together and form a peace process. And that's why, tragically, the realist thinks this conflict will last for many, many more years, and many, many more lives will be lost. All right, guys, that's it for today. What do you guys think about the tragic situation for the Syrian civil war? What are your solutions for the civil war? I'd love to hear that. Comment below, like our Facebook page, subscribe to the channel, and remember, reality always trumps ideology.